Please give a warm welcome to Mark Bernardo, Senior VP, Customer Success at Flashpoint. This session will focus on redefining the rules, harnessing risk intelligence for fortified ICS security.
Thank you all. Really honored to be here with you today. Have a confession to make. Unlike most of you, likely, I am not a traditional cybersecurity expert, although I spent 30 years of my life in this space, building SCADA systems, serving the customers in this community, so I definitely bring a point of view that understands the unique challenges that the industry faces. I also saw how technology completely transformed industry, completely transformed operations, made people's lives better, but on the flip side, created a degree of chaos in the spirit of that, especially, over the last 10 years with the explosion of data, with IoT. I don't need to tell you all what those challenges actually look like. So I'm going to start with this quote. Something else about me. So I spent 25 years of my life in the martial arts. I love reading. I love continuing to practice. And this woman, Evie Pamporis, was a special agent. She wrote a book last year. I was reading the book, and this quote popped off the page. And the reason it popped off the page is because when she was explaining the background of this, she basically said that she wears Kevlar everywhere she goes. And the reason she does it is because those multiple layers create a layer of protection that she wouldn't otherwise have. No, she's not unstoppable, but she's harder to stop. And when we think about this particular space and the opportunities we have, clearly there is no zero risk scenario. But there are things that we can do to clearly reduce the risk substantially if we think about it correctly. So let's do a little bit of a backdrop. Again, most of these things you likely already know, but depending on what stat you look at, this particular space, especially when you think manufacturing, is the 1, 2, or 3rd most likely group to be attacked, especially through ransomware over the past few years. 40% of the global ICS systems experienced some type of attack over the past year. According to Microsoft, 75% of the most common industrial controllers have some type of high severity vuln. 98% of the organizations have a relationship with a third-party vendor that has been breached. This one's really important, right? Especially as we pace forward, especially as we start to get into the meat of the conversation around applying threat intelligence to all the other practices you already have. I've worked with companies that are immensely secure at the edge. I don't know, I'm running a little bit too hot here. Running immensely secure at the edge, but were exposed through their supply chain. Had a pharmaceutical company last year who had a pretty major breach because of a relationship they had with a supplier in Africa at that time. And then the last one is, 25% of the enterprise attacks are going to involve IoT, yet it only represents a real small percentage of the budget. Right. And then you look at the whys. Biggest one for me is the attack surface that's expanded dramatically over the past 10 years as we discussed. The fact that we still have an immense amount of legacy systems that are immensely hard to see and to patch. And the point on seeing is one that I also want us to take away. If there's maybe one big so what in everything that we're going to talk about today is how do we expand our visibility into risk? And I am very intentional about that, right? The risk word, not in terms of visibility into the number of vulns that are out there or the number of ransomware events out there or any other potential attacks. It is about visibility into risk. Limited expertise is also another one. The number of cyber professionals in this particular space who know the OT layer and all the different risks associated with it, it's just not really high. There's a way larger need than there are people. Regulatory compliance this year, right? SEC came down and has a brand new regulation, right? By the end of this year, everyone needs to disclose any type of breaches they have within 4 days. So that's applying pressure. And then obviously the supply chain that we just talked about. The interesting thing also about the regulatory compliance issue, I forgot where I read this stat, might have been Gartner, but they had surveyed customers and asked like what their biggest fear was. Is it a fear of being attacked, or is it a fear of being non-compliant? And it was basically a wash, right? The fear of being attacked was maybe 1 or 2 points higher, which kind of blew my mind, but it's real, and it's things that we have to kind of work through. So, impact and opportunity, right? This space is one that is definitely ripe for chaos. You have immediate impact that can be seen and felt with a successful attack, not just monetarily, but brand that can be exposed. And right now, as we're going to also see, there's real strategic groups out there that are thinking about how to collect as much data as possible so that they can launch a very intentional weaponized attack in these areas, right? Thankfully, we haven't seen many of those, but as we think about it, and as you look at what's going on out there in the chatter, that's kind of the big so what. This data, so the business that I work from, we actually obviously catalog all this data. The data on the left-hand side comes from our database, and if you look at the data breach for Q3 specifically, the top 5 industries, you can see manufacturing down there at 148, so that's breach events. And then you go to the top right, so far this year, $6.7 billion, 6.7 billion records already stolen. But this is the one I really want you to look at, right? This large swath right here, if you look at data breaches by type, nearly 40% of all data breaches are going to be ransomware. And then you go to the right-hand side, so this is from the FBI database, and 1/3 of the ransomware events are in critical infrastructure, right? So this is material stuff. And my ask of you is to definitely think beyond everything you're doing today and really ask yourself the question, what are you doing to look around the corners to see where potential breaches or potential attacks may come from, and what type of groups are going to be behind that, and what their tactics are, right? Because a lot of this stuff, you can be as powerful as you want to be at the edge, but if there's a new vector or a new tactic and you aren't prepared for it, that's where most of the breaches are going to occur. So let's go back in time and walk this all the way through from the very beginning. I guess would be a little too big, but if you look at pre-2000s, right? This is when, for all intents and purposes, none of us really had to worry about this stuff. Maybe, so me going back, yes, I actually had punch cards, right, where people would hack them by, changing the little dots, but that's all we had to worry about. But for all intents and purposes, life from a cybersecurity perspective was pretty good. And then we started to move forward where the internet started to take hold, enterprises started to get connected, and I don't know, back in like 2003, does anyone remember the Slammer breach that went out? It was basically a breach that went after SQL servers and effectively brought the entire world down at some level. Everything slowed down. And the key point that came out of that particular breach that informed how people are going to look at this particular market in a different way is there was a nuclear power plant in Ohio that was impacted by that breach, inadvertently, but they were impacted by the breach. And that started to inform, right, the criminal world to say, we can do something with this. And that's when the tactics started to shift. And that's when you'll see things move into, and by the way, right, we have Stuxnet, this thing that I'll get to in a minute, but that was a manifestation of that first discovery, right? How do we become intentional about attacking control systems? Then we continue to move forward. Advanced persistent threats start to become a thing. This is not opportunistic anymore. This is very intentional. You see things like Black Energy and Havex and Triton or Trisis, depending on how you look at it, right, come out. Malware that was very intentional about these particular communities. Move forward a little bit more. IT, OT convergence, and COVID, right? The push to remote caused massive chaos for the unprepared. Focus on zero trust, and I'm going to key in on collaboration, right? The other thing that you really started to see, I don't know how many people here are involved in ISACs, but my advice would be if you don't have in a community in the worlds that you live in to exchange information and what you're seeing, definitely participate. Some of the best prepared companies that we work with are very collaborative across industries, and it's been really impactful. Like a lot of our communities are in healthcare, in the financial industry, in tech, and been really helpful for them. And then the emerging wave, right? AI, enhanced focus on human factors in ICS, and then the regulatory landscape that we talked about. And AI, right, is going to create this whole thing to reset again, because back here, there was a set of unknown unknowns. No one knew anything. And then we kind of moved right over, and they became unknown knowns. And then we finally got really close to say, we kind of got a good understanding of like all the different vectors and all the different risks. Not going to be 100%, but we're pretty solid. AI is going to just blow this whole thing up, right? It is a tool that we can use to our advantage, and it is a tool that the attackers are using to their advantage as well, right? So we've really got to be thoughtful about how we prepare for that. Let's look at Stuxnet. And the reason I want to say this is, again, go back to where history can inform the future and what this actually means, right? This was beyond just like a watershed moment. This really resulted in those 6 pieces on the right-hand side. First substantial cyber attack in ICS, right? The other one was opportunistic. This was intentional. The focus was on physical impact of the equipment or, in fact, people on the ground. Malware weaponization, which I think is going to continue to grow. The supply chain security, so this was an impacted SCADA system, as we all remember. Human risk and cyber hygiene, so this is what people were just, a little undiligent, let's just say, which created the opening for this to happen. And again, right, what this started to also do is create that opening for collaboration. So with this, we've talked about history. Let's start looking forward. And this is not anything that I'm saying that is, meant to scare anybody. This is based on what people are forecasting, but it's also based on, if you follow the patterns, what do we think is going to happen? By 2025, 21 billion connected IoT devices, $10.5 trillion annual cost of cybercrime. 45% of the global orgs are going to be impacted in by some type of cyber attack in some way. Orgs using cyber risk as a primary factor. So that's 60%. What does that mean to us? Right, that means that cybersecurity is moving from an IT level issue into a business level issue. When people are looking at acquisitions or mergers, right, they actually ask for their cyber profiles and how diligent their plans are as part of the process. And then you go all the way to the right, and this is what we seeded, right? Cyber attacks will have weaponized OT environments to harm humans. So this is a quote from the European agency, and what they're finding is attackers are not just using what they find in opportunistic ways anymore. They're keeping a treasure trove of information so they can actually be strategic about who to attack and how to attack it. So again, right, this begs all of us to be way smarter than them and to look at their techniques, look at their procedures, look at how they're attacking other industries, and then look at our own risk profile and figure out where we need to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about being proactive. More interconnected our systems become, the more sophisticated and targeted threats involved. And as the attack surface expands, so does the potential for collateral damage, right? So this is really the springboard as we move forward into how do we complement what we already are doing to prevent as much collateral damage as possible. And this is about kind of looking around corners. So I mentioned I'm an avid book reader. I mentioned that I love, right, the world of personal protection and martial arts and all that fun stuff. So there's another gentleman named Gavin Becker. He used to work for the FBI. He was like a very famous FBI profiler. And he wrote this book called The Gift of Fear. And the whole genesis of the book, in part, was to trust your instincts, but also that the data is around us that we can use to predict the likelihood of an attack, right? And obviously, I'm not going to talk about like everything he said there, but that's a key thing, right? If you really can start to think about what's our exposure, what's going on in industry, what's going on in markets like us, what's going on in the supply chain that we have, and we can figure out if there's any urgency from a particular attacker or even a nation state, we can be more thoughtful about what we do about it. So when we think about threat intelligence, does anyone have kind of a threat intelligence team, a cyber threat team, anything like that today? Yeah. So for people who don't, again, where I come from, so I worked for GE for a long, long time. And we had a lot of cyber investment, but we didn't have a lot of threat intel. And when I joined the company I work for right now, which is Flashpoint, part of the reason I joined that company was because of this, right? Because I really wanted to belong to a company that has a mission that is going to allow us to create a safer world. And the thing that blew my mind is to actually look and see that there are stores, there are marketplaces you could go to with nice logos and marketing campaigns where you can buy leaked credentials, or you can pay people to stand up an infrastructure so you can move the data that you just exfiltrated in a ransomware event over to a system so you could store it securely. Right? There's a whole market for this. It blows my mind. But again, most of us, when we think about cyber, we don't think about that part. So when you look at threat intelligence, this is about proactive insights. This is about context. This is about enrichment on top of the data that we have. Like, so imagine if you knew that there were particular vulnerabilities that were exposed, but you could also know what threat actors are most likely to use the vulnerability and how they actually leverage it. So the how and the who, that could be pretty powerful information, right? That's really the essence of what threat intelligence is about. So benefits, it widens the aperture. It offers insights into how the threat actors are discussing and planning particular attacks. And it assists in identifying the threat actors. And this also could be very useful when an attack is going on. Again, just think about how normal warfare works. It's no different in this particular space. And then the three types of threat intelligence. So you think about strategic threat intelligence. This is macro level stuff. This is the themes that are changing. So like ransomware being a pretty active event right now would be an example of what strategic threat intelligence could give us. What your competitors are doing if you're a particular business and how they're protecting themselves can inform, right? That's strategic threat intelligence. Operational threat intelligence is the here and now. This is about the vulns that are going on. This is about the security events that you're being notified with. And then tactical threat intelligence is about like the techniques. This is about the indicators of compromise. This is about the procedures that the attackers are using, right? So these are the different tiers that can be layered into the equation. And if you say, well, how does this actually complement what we do? Proactive threat detection, we've already talked about. Improved incident response. So again, if you have up-to-date information on the threat actors and how they're actually attacking other industries, you can apply that knowledge to create an incident response plan that's a little bit more intentional. And why does all this matter? Because all of you and all of your companies typically have limited resources, right? And it's all about how do you prioritize where you spend those resources most effectively to protect yourself at the highest degree. And these are the types of things that can actually help you. Enhanced risk management. This is, again, how do we just make sure we're applying it to the most critical risks? Who are the threat actors? That supply chain risk management piece is a major, major hole for most of the companies that we deal with right now. It's just something that hasn't been given much thought to and is really starting to take hold. And then strategic decision making, right? So that's the backdrop of threat intel. And then how do we start to leverage this into the world that likely you are all living in? So if we stay here and we just think about how we take all the raw data and make it more actionable. Well, when I was working for GE, this was the time of big data, and the intention was it's better to have data and not need it than need data and not have it. Just collect everything. We'll figure it out. And I walked into a pharmaceutical company that we're working with, and the senior VP came out, and they were kind of appalled with what we deployed. Because his point was, you have now made my job untenable. And the quote that I remember is, the untrained eye looks everywhere. He's like, I have a group of untrained people because all of my really senior people who knew the domain have exited. And now everything is noise. So they can't pull the signal through the noise at all. And as a result, I'm getting calls every day of the week, every night of the week, and the weekends to try to discern all these risks. And that's really the same thing here. If you think about just vulns, there's over 300,000 vulnerabilities out there in cataloged. You can't patch them all, right? But if you start to go through a funnel and you look at the CVSS scores, you look at the EPSS scores, and you start to think about the risks that you have in your particular organization, you can get down to more manageable, right, techniques. And this is just another interesting data point, right? Of all the particular vulns out there, the 325,000 known vulnerabilities, 98,000 don't have a CVE. They're just sitting out there. So when you really now start to look at that and think about it at a wider scale, right? The ones that they do track, they're often late. It's very confusing. How bad are they? Like we have vulns that are cataloged that have a CVE that a researcher found. They're probably not going to ever impact you. But you don't know that. So we've got to make sure, again, that we're thinking about the risks to our organization and also thinking about the fact that data breaches on the heels of this aren't a matter of if, they're a matter of when. They will occur. How do you just reduce the risk of that from happening? So if we start to think about the how, obviously, awareness training for phishing. You look at many of the biggest attacks. I think Trisis was actually one of them, as a matter of fact. It was based on a phishing campaign, right? Somebody they couldn't help themselves. They clicked on the link, and that's all it took. Invest in email security and account monitoring, so account takedowns are a big deal. RDP and VPN, make sure that we're continuing to monitor that, but always be patching, but patch the right vulns. And I talk about this, and we have a product that does this, but it doesn't need to necessarily come from a particular product, right? The last point I'm going to make in this whole slide is, this is not about perfection. This is about just starting to do something more. And there's things that you can start doing out there just by using normal searches, subscribing to threat intel feeds that are going to improve your visibility. And yes, there are also platforms that you can buy. But what I'm going to take you through right now is just a real basic flow of what a ransomware attack looks like. At the very beginning, all our attackers are doing is the same thing that we do for ourselves. They are continuously scanning everything. They're looking for an in. And as soon as they get an in, they move laterally. They quickly go out throughout the network. They've got to move with speed because the slower they move, the quicker they're going to be detected. And once they do that, that's when they start walking the chain to get higher level admin capability. And once they have that, within two days, effectively, that's when we see them start to ideally steal the data from their perspective. And then they encrypt the systems to lock everything down, and then they own you, right? So what are the top three access vectors when ransomware attacks occur? It's all the simple ones. It's leaked credentials. Again, going back to that marketplace, you could go there tonight and you could buy credentials for a business from anywhere between $5 and $15, right? The access is cheap. It's super cheap. Brute force RDP and then unpatched vulns, right? right? Those are the three major ones. I'm going to jump down to here, because we just kind of talked about everything up there. What do you do with all this? Prioritize the right security patches. Ensure you have insights into stolen credentials. So again, there are tools out there that can help you with this, and there are also feeds that can give you insights. You just have to say, like, it could be a domain that you're looking for, and like all the domains you use in your business, or particular email addresses. You can find out if there's exposure. If there's exposure, there's risk. Proactive monitoring of ransomware leak sites, we talked about that. Conduct ransomware workshops. Again, this is almost like a tabletop exercise, if you will. And in the event of attack, just make sure you have a plan. Just make sure you have a plan. Because as time goes by, so does risk. I mean, I've watched some companies just get drained because they didn't have a plan. So let's wrap this with just some things to keep in mind. Better data is key, and context is king. Context to your organization. That person's high priority vuln is not necessarily your high priority vuln, right? Really understand all of your assets. The gentleman who came before me, what I heard him signal is like asset visibility or asset cataloging is a real problem. Guarantee you, it's a real problem. Be thoughtful aware of what your assets are, what the risk exposure is, and then from there you can make a better decision in terms of what you do with it. The third one is bolster your cyber program with threat intelligence. This is about either acquire a tool, subscribe to feeds, do really advanced Google searches, whatever you need to do, but do something to increase that aperture of risk on top of what you're doing today. This whole concept of cybersecurity being a team sport, collaborate, right? Join ICS, talk to your competitors at sometimes, right? It means you don't have to share confidential information, but you can talk about what you're seeing out in the market, because that's what the attackers do. They get together, they collaborate, right? We need to do the same. The other thing is, think about your own businesses. So at GE, we had silos, like real silos between our IT and our operational team, right? Obviously, no surprise to any of you. But with that silo becomes a lack of information sharing. I work with businesses right now that have a CTI team and have a SOC and have a completely separate team, like a vulnerability management team, and they don't talk to each other. They have separate budgets, completely. And you think about cyber being a universal, holistic problem. There has to be a forcing function. So think about that. Rethink zero trust. This is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be applied to your particular business. But you really do need to think about, validate everything that is critical to you. Not everything, but everything that is critical to you. Prioritize human training. Think about like Target and the Saudi power plants, what happened in Ukraine. All of these were triggered by some type of human error. Human error. Doesn't matter what you all do with technology, if people are still not going to behave appropriately, if you will, we're going to have problems. So that's this one, and then commit to progress, not perfection, right? Just start doing something more than you're doing today. So with that, I'm gonna pause and see if y'all have any questions.
How accurate is the EPSS? Or compared to the total vulnerability for all the CPEs that are listed?
Yeah, from what we look at, the EPSS score is actually a better indicator for overall risk. But again, I think the thing that you would need to look at in your business is what type of assets do you have? How many assets do you have? Some of the scoring can be a little bit better if you're looking at CVSS versus EPSS. But for us, when we look at an EPSS score, it also tends to be a better indicator of ransomware risk, right? The overall vuln, the overall CVSS score is not so much.
But your funnel, you said, you're starting with the CVSS.
Yep.
Which kind of said, okay, this is where we start, and then we go
Yep.
take a second look. Is that kind of the process?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
me like what you're telling companies is you don't have to be perfect. You just got to do something. And along with that, the collaboration, that education allows you to recognize opportunities. And when you have that collaboration between the different departments, that everybody's got a different perspective, which somebody's going to recognize something that somebody else missed.
You are 100% correct. And so think about it like, where's the white space? And in some of our companies, this is a real world environment, the white space for them was actually physical threats. So they had executive members that were traveling and being threatened as they traveled, and there was no visibility into like how big that threat was. Because again, if you look at it's amazing when you start to unpack even some of the social media feeds. Like the chatter is real. Like we'll pick up on chatter like when state officials start to travel. You will see chatter on the ground in the target destination. And if you are a high-profile executive at a really well-known company that someone is looking to, pull money from, it's an attack vector that's real. And like that was just an example of white space that started to occur when everyone sat down and said, let's look at risk as a holistic thing versus risk, right, in our tech stack specifically. So you're absolutely right. White space is the big deal. Other questions?
I'll tell you, along with your white space, that Mr. Dell, who would go out and had his own security team that he paid $1 million a year for security, was informed by his security team that if his daughter didn't stop posting on TikTok and Facebook where they were old, he was going to have to find a new security team.
Yep. Yeah, it's seriously, it's real. I mean, yeah, we've got to rethink everything. But again, right, just ask the question and collaborate.
Journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step.
Amen. Amen. All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate your time today. Have a great rest of your conference. You take care. Thank you.